And we are live. Hello and assalamu alaikum. Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Sabina Khan-Ibarra and I'm moderating this panel on behalf of MuslimARC, Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative. Our topic today is Asian Muslim voices and experiences of being Asian and Muslim. We hope to show different Asian individuals and communities and how they have developed and maintained Muslim identities. We want to also touch upon issues of migration, social networks, identity, and religious authority among Asian Muslims. Please join the conversation right now over on Twitter using the hashtag Asian Muslim Voices and hashtag Being Asian Muslim. But before we get to the questions and comments, I'll introduce you to today's panel. You can get their full bios at www.muslimarc.org. Our respected panelists today are Nafisa Tang, a first-generation Chinese-American, talented and successful graphic designer and blogger from California. She received her degree from the Art Institute of San Diego. Her mother is Taiwanese and her father from Singapore, with both sides from mainland China. Nafisa, welcome to the panel.
Thank you very much.
Our next panelist is Dr. Sylvia Chan-Malik. She joins us from Rutgers University, where she is Assistant Professor of American Women's and Gender Studies. Dr. Chan-Malik, we're glad to have you here.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Okay, and we have Dr. Arshad Ali, Assistant Professor of Educational Research at George Washington University. His research focuses on youth cultural studies, race and ethnicity in urban education, and responsive research methodologies. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you for having us.
Okay, we look forward to learning a lot from you all, and let's just get started right away. Our first question is, when we talk about Asian Muslims, who are we talking about, and what are some of the different Asian cultures represented in the U.S. and around the world? Dr. Ali, why don't you start?
Well, I think that's a tricky question. I mean, I think the question of when we say the term Asian, who that references, and that references different bodies in different parts of the world. Right now I'm based in the UK, and when we say the word Asian here, it primarily references South Asian bodies, while in the US it indexes something different. So we have to remember these geographies that we talk about, whether they're Asian, Latin American, or African, any kind of particular geography has particular resonance in the particular context we're talking about. So I think when we're talking about Asian Muslims in the U.S., popularly, I think that often references individuals from South Asia. But I think if we're thinking about Asia as a geography, there's a vast diversity. And even if we think about South Asia as a geographic place, the diversities of Islam, of Muslims who are coming from those regions. As we talk about Asia as a continent, we also have to think about Southeast Asia, East Asia. We also have to think about West Asia. Oftentimes what we talk about is the Middle East. We can also talk about as West Asia. So I think that broad swath of land from the Middle East, right, the geographic continent of Asia, if that's what we mean by Asian Muslims, we have to ask what actually is coherent across all of those lands for all of those bodies. And then when we talk about how that translates into the lives of individuals who originate ethnically, geographically from that part of the world, what does that actually mean, and what kinds of resonance does that have? Or is it oftentimes, I think, mythic ideas of what home is, what homeland is, what Asian Islam is, or what Islam is for us back home. And oftentimes those are kind of narratives that we're constructing that often don't map onto the lives and experiences in those parts of the world. Those are just some general kind of thoughts, but I think lots of people have lots of more interesting things to say.
No, that was really quite, I would say it's something that I hadn't thought about, because we don't think of Middle East when we think of Asia, and that's something that's important to mention. Dr. Chan-Malik, what do you think?
So I want to split that into two separate questions. As Dr. Ali said, who is Asian very much depends on the geographical context you're in. Like I teach my students all the time, there are no Asians in Asia. In Asia, you are Chinese or Korean or Thai or Indian, so that's kind of one of the first things that I teach my students in Asian American Studies classes, that Asian in itself is a racialized construct that we have in this country because certain types of bodies are kind of grouped together culturally, phenotypically, because of geography, because of region, etc. So within the U.S. context, which is the context that I both, was raised in, work in, and study, when in the U.S. when we say Asian, generally, historically, what we mean is East Asian, because the earliest Asian immigrants to the U.S. were Chinese, Japanese, and Filipinos as well. So they came from a certain region and they looked a certain way, so that in the U.S., when we talk about Asians and then Orientals, right, what we're talking about is people who look like they are of East Asian descent, right? So then the second part of that question, and historically the Chinese came over in the mid 19th century to build the railroads en masse in large groups, right? So that was a group that's been here a long time as a presence. When we talk about Asian Muslims, however, when you're in the Muslim community, the Asians would be, in a U.S. context again, there's the divide between the South Asians and the Arabs. Right? So the three main groups within the Muslim American community is the South Asians, the Arabs, and the African Americans. Right? Those are the three major groups within the U.S. Muslim population. Right? And so it's kind of a weird friction there, because in the U.S. context, Asians are generally associated with East Asians, but in the Muslim community, the Asians are the Indians, the Pakistanis, the Bangladeshis, and then and then you have the other groups. We all know Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world, right? It has the largest Muslim population. Right? But we don't really talk about Indonesian Muslims or Thai Muslims or Singaporean Muslims, which there are great numbers of. So again, it's about that context. And so in talking about this topic, it's wonderful to have this conversation, because we can sort of be more specific about these terms that people throw around in kind of vague generalities, and really, kind of get down to what we mean and why they mean what they mean in the different contexts we use them in. Right?
Yes. So dissecting this term, and Nafisa, what are your thoughts?
Well, most of it was covered, but I think from a non-Muslim perspective, a lot of times when I mention being Asian Muslim, people immediately know what I mean. Because to non-Muslims, they don't really think within that context of the Muslim world in America. So when it comes to the younger generation, at least people I've talked to and stuff, I feel that there starts to become this divide between what's Asian and what's considered yellow. Because the yellow identity is starting to become more of a thing, which refers to Southeast and East Asians. People who kind of have that Oriental look. I mean, as much as I hate saying that word, right? But the geographical identity of Asian is starting to become bigger, and I think it's evolving. And I know so many my South Asian friends who consider themselves Asian as well, and because there are a lot of shared experiences within that, it does come together pretty easily. And I think that the historical Asian ideal is becoming more of a yellow ideal, and the Asian is becoming more pan-Asian, at least from what I've seen, and in my area and stuff. So again, when you talk about Asian Muslims to non-Muslims, I feel that there's this immediate click for a lot of them, because to them, Arab and Desi Muslims are the default, and Asian Muslims are kind of seen as this oh, you mean Chinese Muslims, and it's they kind of get it immediately, which is very strange, because Sylvia was saying, within the Muslim community in America, when you say Asian Muslims, they think of Pakistanis or Indians and stuff, So just from my experiences, I've seen this kind of divide between Asian and yellow,
Yes, interesting. So yeah, I'm glad that you guys all answered in very different ways and all very important, and we're able to see the nuances just with that term Asian Muslims. So let's see. The next question, and Dr. Lee, I'll have you answer again first. Where are some of the largest Asian Muslim communities in the U.S. for Southeast Asians, as far as you know, East Asians, Central Asians, and South Asians?
Well, I hope we don't always go in this order. But, you know, and I think other people can answer this question much more robustly because I don't have a strong knowledge of where lots of these communities are based. I mean, I think when I think about South Asian communities in the U.S., we know that there's large concentrations in places like the New York metropolitan area. So that includes New York City, but that also includes you know, parts of New Jersey. We also know that's in you know, there's large concentrations in California, in Chicago, in Dallas, and Houston. But when we talk about even these concentrations, we have to remember that it's not citywide. Like when we talk about South Asian communities, let's say in New York City, we're not talking about Manhattan, or we're not talking about Lower Manhattan. We're talking about Queens, and we're talking about particular neighborhoods with particular kind of migratory histories, economic realities, and social realities. You know, other places we might see large concentrations are in the San Francisco Bay Area, where there's a large Afghani population. And I think, you know, we see other populations like somewhat of a Hmong community, like a Hmong Muslim community in the Orange County parts of Southern California. But I think other people on this panel probably have a better sense of the geographies. So I'm gonna, I'll leave that to others.
Okay, so Dr. Chan-Malik, what do you?
I don't know. Well, okay, I will cite the numbers I do know. But, you know, because it's very difficult to get data on religious populations because the census does not count religions in the U.S. So all of the numbers that all the data that we have on religious identities and religious communities is either, you know, kind of, you know, our own experience, but there was a Pew Center research study on American Muslims done, I think, 3 or 4 years ago, and I mean the conclusion was that it's an incredibly diverse community. There's over 60 ethnicities kind of that have strong communities in the U.S. or, you know, representative communities, and so many of the places, you know, the places we know, Detroit, you know, it's you know, the largest. So many Arab countries, the largest population of those groups outside of their home countries. LA is the largest population of Iranians outside of Iran, right? So, and some of these are Muslim communities, and some of them are not, because as we know, it's, you know, people from particular countries that are quote unquote Islamic are also religiously diverse. So I would just kind of go with what Dr. Ali, what Arshad said, in terms of, you know, there are, you know, I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area, like you are, Sabina, and so you know, it's plentiful. And also in terms of, just from knowing restaurants, like in San Francisco and in Silicon Valley and in New York, you have halal Chinese restaurants. You have, you know, kind of Afghani Chinese food, kind of fusion restaurants, and you know that if these restaurants are opening, these populations are there. I mean, I know that's a very facile way to kind of name it, but here in New Jersey, there's a few less of those. I mean, they do exist, but if you went to the Midwest or to Texas, I don't think any would exist, right? You wouldn't have a place like Darda, which is like my favorite restaurant in the Bay Area, which is halal Chinese food that has flatbread and curried lamb and all these types of things, right? So yeah, I mean, there are certain places, New York, San Francisco, Detroit, Chicago, etc., that have these larger populations.
Okay, and Nafisa, did you have anything to add, or did you have any insight?
No. I'm actually pretty disconnected from like greater like Muslim communities, so like when it comes to like this type of stuff, I don't have any idea really.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry I couldn't contribute to that question.
I think Nafisa should go first next time.
I'm gonna actually have her
just so you can get the worst out of the way.
I'm sorry, Nafisa.
All she has to say is I agree with everybody, right? Okay. So Nafisa, get ready.
Oh wait, you're serious? Okay, I'm ready.
Because of the diversity we just spoke about, many religions are practiced across Asia. You know, religious tensions can arise at times between different religious groups in any region. To what extent does this occur between Muslim groups and other religious groups, such as Hindus, Buddhists, Sikhs in Asia? How do you address these negative attitudes towards each other? Nafisa, do you?
Like between religious groups in Asia?
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's like, I have a pretty strange and nuanced view of it because I get most of these stories from my parents. Both of them were like chased out of mainland. They're not them specifically, but their families were chased out of mainland by the communists. And so my mother's family ended up in Taiwan, and my dad's family ended up in Malaysia or Singapore. So for my dad growing up in Singapore, like he came from I get my Muslim side from my dad, and he when he grew up there, like he had like these very prejudiced ideas against like Hindus and there was more, and Sikhs and stuff, and even like Shia Muslims. So like growing up, I was kind of like, you know, brainwashed by that, by those cultural like isms, I guess, and I honestly don't know how to address that kind of stuff because I have an American context growing up, and it's actually much easier, in my opinion, for U.S. Non-Christian like identifying people to band together because we have like a similar marginalization. Whereas my dad's like culture growing up, it felt very, from the stories he's told me anyway, it felt very much like it was like, you know, very multicultural and like people were kind of free to do whatever. So it's not really a question I think about very often because I try to focus most of like these kinds of like kind of intersections for a U.S. context because it's what I know. It's really and personally I don't really think it's right for a U.S. citizen to talk about like these kinds of intersections in other countries. It just, you know, U.S. supremacy, like ideals and stuff. I really hate it. So on the flip side, though, for my mother, she grew up in like this sort of Buddhist agnostic, culturally like religious, you know, family household, and never really did much with it. She had some very strange ideas of Islam before she married my dad, though, and like before their marriage, she would constantly be asked like, "Can you live without pork?" You know, and like, "Can you live without alcohol?" And like, she was just like, "I guess." You know, and her view of like religions in general, especially like Abrahamic faiths, was always a little weird, you know. So when it comes to my parents, like it's really just a matter of like talking to them about it. But for bigger context stuff, like I can't say I have like very much to say about that. Again, U.S. context and like Asia is like a very big and diverse continent. But,
I really appreciate your personal experience and your personal thoughts on the subject. But I was wondering if Dr. Ali or Dr. Chan-Malik have something to add to that.
Well, just, I mean, Arshad, you might have lots more to say about this as well, but we see this happening right now with the election of Modi in India, right? You know, this is, and I've been working you know, with other activists. South Asian activist community is very active in kind of anti-Islamophobia efforts and things like that, especially here on the East Coast and the Bay Area. But however, I mean, you do have these kind of tensions that happen in the community, both in mainstream politics and political organizing between, you know, there's this kind of presence of Hindu nationalism and you know, kind of Indian Muslims. You know, people bring over the types of political antagonisms of their home countries into their new context. They don't go away because you immigrate, right? You carry those with you. So, for example, you know, I work and you know, I'm very close to Pakistani Ahmadi communities. And so I realized that because of issues in Pakistan with the blasphemy laws and all those types of things, those same types of attitudes have traveled to the U.S. so that African American Ahmadis and other Ahmadis that have been here a long time, living and working and existing as Muslims, all of a sudden in the post-1965 era, where there's a lot more Pakistanis coming from Pakistan to the U.S., all of a sudden there's a lot more anti-Ahmadi sentiment in the U.S. than there ever was prior to that. You know, so these same types of things carry over, and then they have this new context in the U.S. to sort of, you know, try to figure out how to do that, because as Nafisa said, at the same time, you know, if you're not Muslim, if you're a quote-unquote mainstream American, who can tell the difference? Who knows the difference between a Sunni and a Shia and a Hindu and a Muslim? And, you know, like, what the heck? What's the difference, right? So on the one hand, you have a shared sort of marginalization as quote-unquote Orientals or the other or the Muslims or the terrorists. And on the other hand, everybody is complicated and everybody has their own history, so they bring those over. So it's always this tension, you know, between, am I a Muslim American? Or am I a Muslim, or am I American of Pakistani Muslim descent? You know, so it's kind of this very complicated, again, kind of way of thinking about our identities as Muslims in the U.S. So, you know, Arshad, I'm sure you have something more to add about that. But yeah, we see that play out all the time, these tensions, and then how do you become an American? You know, so.
Dr. Ali?
Well, I think both of those responses were wonderful, and I think, you know, one, I really appreciated Nafisa's comment about being wary of being prescriptive from sitting in the West and telling kind of people in other parts of the world how they should be living their lives, or how to address problems in their own context, in their own communities. And I think similar, and I also really appreciated Sylvia's complication of the idea of cultures over there versus cultures here, and the idea that cultures flow, and relationships, ideas about the other, about the self, what makes me who I am, or what makes my identity somehow coherent. Those aren't things that are shed when people get on planes or get on boats or leave their countries, but they are carried over in complicated ways. And they oftentimes they reform, and they remake themselves in different contexts, and sometimes very violent and very hurtful ways. But there's also the opportunity for them to remake themselves in very powerful ways, and in ways that help people build communities and build connections. I think you know, lots of these attitudes like that have been mentioned around not people from non-Muslim backgrounds. We also see that within Muslim communities. We see these same types of violence playing out within Muslim communities themselves, whether it's physical violence or linguistic or ideological violence. We see those same things happening. And I think, at least for myself, living in the U.S. and now in a British context, but primarily in the English-speaking West, I mean, I think one of the ways we think about, or for me to think about, how we build connections is by thinking about our shared histories as well as our shared futures. And I think the shared futures part is particularly important for me, because oftentimes communities that are embattled and that are struggling against the same structures of white supremacy, the same structures of capitalism, and they're affecting everybody. Sometimes they're affecting people in different ways. So I think sometimes if we can, I guess the phrase is, you see the forest from the trees, or to see the tree, I don't know.
Forest for the trees, yeah.
You know, sometimes it's just being able to step back and think about some of those issues.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you for your answers. So we're going to move from that to discussing questions of identity. I guess we've already been doing that kind of, but authority and inclusion. For instance, for Asian American converts to Islam, I don't know if any of you have any insight to this, but is there a struggle to balance cultural identity and religion? How do you find your balance? And I think I'll go with Dr. Chan-Malik first.
Well, yeah, that would make sense, as I'm the convert here. Okay, so I'll just give a tiny bit of context, not to take too much time. But I started studying Islam as a student right after 9/11. because I had been doing a lot of activism in the Bay Area, and right after 9/11, Asian American activism, and with African American communities as well, working in the public schools, etc. And I had just started grad school, and 9/11 happened, and I also met my future husband, who happened to be Muslim, and we became friends, and so I started learning about it. And I was incredibly blessed and incredibly lucky to, in the Bay Area, have such a diverse community, which might not have been the case anywhere else in this country, where I had a Quran reading group that had people of all colors and shapes and backgrounds and kind of political orientations, etc. And so eventually, 2 years later, I took my Shahada, and I hadn't really thought about it being kind of a very incompatible, I felt like an Asian American. It was a political identity, and it seemed like I had found a religious structure and faith that worked for me as a person. But and I didn't think my family would have much of an issue with it. But Nafisa, you said the funniest thing. Like, that was the first thing that people would say is like, oh, you can't eat chashu bao anymore. You can't eat like pork buns. Or what are you going to do? You can't eat this. Or how are you going to go out to dinner? Like, everything has pork in it.
Yeah, because so many Chinese cultures are like married to pork. It's really ridiculous.
That was something huge. I mean, that seemed like a cultural, like I was a traitor to my ethnicity, to do that. And that really hurt my mother, because it was like, kind of an idea that I would not be wanting to eat her food. It seemed kind of very personal. Kind of beyond that, I found a lot of things very similar, though, as well. I found the same types of tensions within the Muslim community, kind of between Asian and Arab and African American communities. Those were exactly the same kinds of struggles I had been working with in communities in the Bay Area, like after the LA riots in 1992, kind of thinking about tensions between Asian American shopkeepers and African American communities. And so it has these same types of issues of like, how do you get people to talk across cultures and come to a shared understanding that they're in it together? These same types of things were going on. So in a lot of ways, I feel like, kind of dealing with kind of the personal issues, like struggling to be a Muslim in the face of being Chinese American, and then kind of understanding the different kind of ethnic, kind of groups that made up Muslim American identity. That was it prepared me well to kind of enter the community. It's still interesting. Whenever I see another Asian American convert, I want to talk to them. Like, I'm like, hey, so what happened to you? Why did you do this? I mean, and I hear Nafisa talk, and it's like, it's interesting, because there are these kind of similar feelings, and it's a small group, so you kind of have to draw from where you can find affiliations and connections with who you can.
Yeah, I mean, you're right about the population in the Bay Area being diverse and also very welcoming. So
yes, yeah, I feel incredibly blessed. Yeah, I don't know if that would have happened anywhere else.
Yeah. So. And Nafisa, what are your experiences or experiences your mother may have told you about finding the balance? I mean, we know about the pork. Are there other things that she told you about?
Well, there are quite a few things that are kind of still ongoing. As I grew older, I actually became more religious because I kind of went through several phases of my life where I was like, no, I don't want to be Muslim anymore, And I actually started reading the Quran on my own, and I started to feel closer to the religion. And because of, a lot of the reasons that I was thinking of leaving were very very parental, because my parents never quite saw eye to eye for it. Like, my mom basically converted so that they could marry. And I felt I was very coerced, and I was starting to become very disillusioned with it. But the more I learned about it, the more I started to talk to her about it. And there's still kind of some language problems, because my Mandarin isn't that great, and my mom doesn't speak English at all. So, but as she tells me more, a more full picture I get of her, which I've always thought was really important. And I've been really thankful for that. But she's always kind of struggled with the hijab, actually. the garment itself. My dad kind of comes from this strange place where he feels that like the Chinese culture within Islam doesn't, like, they don't marry well, even though there's a very long like history of Chinese Muslims. He feels that like that became too cultural, and as I study like more things, I start to realize that like there's this false like ideal of like Islam having no culture, where in fact it should be Islam is multicultural. And my dad has consistently tried to appeal to this kind of like sort of Arab-centric kind of Islam, where like a lot of those traditions are considered truer. And so when he tries to push these onto my mother, she rejects them really strongly because they're pretty far from like the East Asian like culture, like as the even within like East Asian culture there's like a bunch. But like when it comes to the hijab, like I had a talk with her once saying that like how just on its own, like it's really debated within the community, and that her choosing whether or not to wear it doesn't make her any less religious, even if she does, like, and even if like that doesn't really bother her at all, you know, she is still pretty agnostic in my opinion. And I find that she's more of a cultural convert than a faith convert. And I do have to, it does pain me because I have to watch her navigate it a lot. And she doesn't like to go to the masjid or to like Muslim functions because she doesn't know how to speak to anybody. You know, she doesn't, whenever we meet like Chinese Muslims, like my dad usually is not very like interested in becoming friends with them. So like there's this really odd, like uncanny place for my family. And like my mom is one of the only like Asian converts that I know of. So like her struggles a lot of times are cultural, and I think that it's because people have this misconception of Islam and culture, because like Islam can be multicultural, but a lot of people think that it has no culture, therefore homogenizing it to the oldest known form, which is a more Arab culture. So my mom struggles more with that religious culture rather than the religion itself. The more I talk with her about the religion, the more she can see eye to eye with me about Islam. And I feel that like approaching it from this kind of like more this more open-ended version of it, she can swallow the ideas better, you know. Not that I'm trying to like brainwash her or anything. I just want her to be able to like come to terms with the fact that she married into a Muslim family and stuff. So
that's really interesting, and you know, that goes for people who aren't converts too. A lot of what you said is trying to first the hijab issue, you know, that being the focal or the central point for some people being Muslim as a woman. You know, that moving away from how women dress, and that's something that I think Muslim women struggle with as well. And other issues, like you said, you know, religious, being a cultural Muslim versus, you know, one who practices, you know, the faith, or how you described it. You describe it better than I do. Dr. Ali, do you have anything you wanted to add?
Sure, I guess I'll just try to make a quick remark. I mean, I think I appreciated, you know, everything that was said. I think, you know, piggybacking a little bit on Nafisa's comment, I think when we talk about this question of like cultural identity and whatever this thing we call Islam is, like we don't talk about that as a tension that exists in places that have been Muslim for you know, or places that we talk about as broadly the Muslim world, right? That struggle doesn't exist, or maybe we don't talk about it as existent within Indonesia, within South Asia, within Ghana, within the Middle East for that matter, or China or anywhere else in the world, because Islam took oftentimes radically different forms in different parts of the globe. But I think when we talk about this thing called Islam as a singular, as one thing, then I think we fall into dangerous territory. I also think, I mean, I think the point you just made, it's interesting that oftentimes this question of Islam becomes primarily around, you know, what makes these questions of cultural identity, or these questions of what makes one a Muslim, oftentimes deal with regulating bodies, and regulating female bodies, and telling them what they can wear and what they can't wear. And what food we can eat or what food we can't eat, but very little of this discussion has anything to do with what one believes, the values one has. And for me, those become those are the central aspects we should be thinking about when we're thinking about this idea of what Islam or Islams are.
Can I just wanted to,
Sure.
I wanted to add something to Nafisa's comments. Nafisa, I wish I could speak Mandarin because I'd love to speak to your mom. I speak Cantonese, but I was just thinking as you were talking, you know, that is definitely something that is true, because I would be, you know, I would part-time wear hijab sometimes, you know, you know, and I would feel more uncomfortable wearing it around my Chinese family than I would in the general public in the Bay Area, right? In the Bay Area, where, you know, I wear a headscarf or whatever, it's fine, you know, like in Berkeley or Oakland, you know, people are fine with it. They don't even look twice, you know, really. I mean, sometimes, but for the most part, no. But if I were to do that and go to a family function, it would be much more difficult for me to explain it and kind of make why I'm doing it make sense to them. Whereas in a U.S. context, even in my classroom or something like that, if I decided to wear hijab to class to teach one day, I would just even feel more at ease about that than around my, you know, Chinese family. So I, you know, as you were saying that, I really realized that there is this tension.
Yeah,
it's
very interesting.
Islam is a religion, and, you know, Chinese-ness is this cultural thing for immigrants, and I'm very sympathetic to my parents and my relatives, because immigrants, they hold on to that. That's what they have, you know, in a strange country. That, you know, that gives them their safety, you know, and who am I to kind of, you know, I just feel, and it's been something that is an ongoing tension. So I appreciated you saying that, because it reminded me that that's very present in my life as well.
I'm really glad that could spark that for you.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's interesting because I have daughters too, and so it's like it's very interesting to think about how they will. They say they're half Chinese, half African American, half Muslim. And I said,
three halves. That's good.
You know, so it's kind of interesting to see how they'll turn out. Yeah.
Yeah. If only there was more acceptance of a fluid hijab and it wasn't, you know, such a big deal to do. So, Dr. Ali, maybe you can answer this question. What are some questions your non-Muslim relatives and or Asian friends have about Islam, and how are they different from the Western perception about the religion?
Interesting question. I mean, I think this question of how they're different is an interesting one for me. I mean, I think oftentimes the questions I receive about Islam are questions that I don't think are unique. They're the questions around kind of that are the popular and kind of the media tropes that deal with Islam and Muslims, whether it's around you know, certain violence, whether it's around treatment of women, or you know, broadly kind of the regulation of female bodies as a whole within Islam. And I think oftentimes, I don't know if I could tease out a fundamental difference between kind of the Western perceptions and what Asian communities broadly, or the types of questions I'm getting broadly from kind of Asian friends from Asian backgrounds or diverse Asian backgrounds.
Okay. And Dr. Chan-Malik, do you agree with that?
I get the most questions about Ramadan, about when I'm with my family and it's Ramadan. And they want me to go eat. And they don't understand how on earth you can go a whole day without not even a sip of water. And they think, you know, it's like, can I just persuade you today to just go have dim sum, just today, one day? It's like, no, it's for a month. You can't just take a break, like whenever you feel like it. You know, so I actually try to. This year I'm actually like with my family for all of Ramadan, like we're in California, but I usually try to avoid them I get a lot of questions about that. You know, but as a teacher, so that's kind of different. Like they're kind of very concerned about like these very day-to-day things. Oh, you can't even have a piece of gum? Like that's insane. So that's my family. And those are my Chinese. That's my Chinese family. As a teacher and as a scholar, I'll go up and I'll do a presentation about, you know, kind of anything about the racialization of Islam or the Iranian women's movement in 1979, and it'll be about really strong, fierce women standing up for their rights and why they wear hijab as a sign of empowerment and all these kinds of things. And there's always somebody that stands up and says, well, what about, you know, genital mutilation? You know, it doesn't matter what you're talking about. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're talking about, you know, Islamic feminism, or it doesn't matter. There's always like, you know, there's like kind of this popular understanding of it that exists in the media. So yeah, different contexts again, and they're kind of concerned. There's this thing called Islam that exists, and no matter what you say about it, and you see it in the comment sections of every single story about Islam ever online. So no matter what you say, no matter how complicated it is, it's still like this thing, and it never changes. And it's about oppressing women, and you know, niqab, and you know, genital mutilation, and all these types of things. So yeah, those are two different contexts where there's two different types of responses for me.
Well, yeah, let's hope that the narrative changes within our lifetime, but you know, we'll see. Lisa, what do you think?
I find it very interesting because there's virtually no difference between what my Asian friends ask me versus what my white friends ask me, the non-Muslim ones, that is. Like, because most of my friends, like, were raised in America, so their view, like, Arshad and, like, Sylvia were both saying, is that it's very, got this, like, kind of US-centric view of Islam, which is that othering kind of, like, violent, like, savage, you know, like, kind of thing. So, like, a lot of those questions all tend to be the same, like, I get a lot of questions about hijab and why I don't wear it, and a lot of times actually people will ask me about the history of Chinese Muslims and stuff because they have no idea. Among like Asian groups, it's always like this really weird area because like I'm an ABC, which is American Born Chinese, so I'm like whitewashed compared to my friends who came here at a young age. But compared to other ABCs and ABAs and stuff, like, I'm, like, really Asian. So then you throw, like, Islam into the mix, and they're just, like, you know, the head explodes. And, like, my Asian friends just don't really know how to place me. And so a lot of times, like, they skirt around it, too. They're like, oh, yeah, you're doing that thing. And I'm like, Ramadan? You know, and it's like, yeah. You know, and, like, it's like they're almost, like, walking on eggshells about my religion. And I don't know if they think they're going to offend me because of, like, popular media or something, or if they just, like, seriously have no idea what to do with it. And it's just so interesting because, like, some of them come from areas where there, like, are Asian community, Muslim communities and stuff. Like, I have a lot of Filipino friends, and they don't know how to address that, even though, like, the Philippines has a pretty sizable Muslim population and stuff. And, like, a lot of my friends who are artists and stuff, like, it's like this really big trend to, like, start being more inclusive with your art. And so they'll like, want to draw, like, hijabis, you know, and promote stuff. And then they'll be like, hey, Nafisa, what are, like, the rules for hijab? And I'm just like, this is such a multi-layered question. Don't even ask me that. Just draw 'em. You know, I know you have good intentions. Don't even ask me. But, like, the hijab is a really big thing. And, like, certain, like, rules, and like they asked me about Ramadan a lot, and it's just really interesting, like being treated as an other when you're already othered with this group, you know, like you're like doubly marginalized, and it's just really uncanny place to be. But it's usually like not really bad, just ignorant. Yeah.
Wow, what a great way to put it, doubly marginalized. So how do you respond to Muslims who feel that Asian Muslim cultures are less Islamic than other Muslim cultures, like for example? Have any of you experienced this, Dr. Chan-Malik?
Oh. I was like, wait, me first. Well, I mean, that's like you were saying that this section of the conversation was about cultural authenticity or authenticity issues in general, both in terms of religious practice and identities, And so that seems to me, both as a Muslim and as a scholar, to be kind of one of the central issues, that there are these, there are particular types of hierarchies within Islam. It's about how well you speak Arabic, how much Quran you read, how much of the Quran you have memorized, and then whoever does that the best, then, or who can do that the best, then you are the best Muslim, right? And so you get to kind of set the guidelines for what that is. Well, if you're from an Arabic-speaking country, you're probably going to speak the best Arabic, right? I mean, that's just kind of, kind of default, right? So, I mean, those kinds of issues, absolutely. I mean, I do feel as if, as someone who came to it later and who did not have, and then who had children and didn't have a lot of time to sit down and learn, the way I wanted to, I could kind of absorb the tenets and the principles and the moral kind of compass a lot more than I could absorb the things that might make you seem like a really good Muslim. And so I would never dream to kind of put myself out there as like a good Muslim. I mean, I study it. That's why I'm a scholar, so I can have that authority to speak about the information. But yes, absolutely, in the communities, you do feel like, I'm just here to listen. I would never kind of venture to say that I know much about anything, to be perfectly honest, except as a scholar. And so that's hard, because I feel that same sort of thing for African American communities as well, when they're dealing with Arab Muslims or South Asian Muslims either, where they're kind of told that your version of Islam is not as authentic. So I think that maybe is an issue for all converts, unless you become a super convert like Hamza Yusuf and kind of master the tradition and devote your life to it. I'm not in any way trying to, in any way say anything negative about Sheikh Hamza. But he's mastered a particular kind of understanding of Islam, which I will never, most likely do myself. So unless you are able to do that, it's very difficult to have a voice that has a real presence in the community.
And Dr. Ali, what would you say is your experience in this?
Well, I mean, I think, I think similarly to Dr. Chan-Malik's, I mean, I think there is a way that both the Arabic language and the idea of Arab Islam is given kind of a higher resonance, and I think, I don't know, I feel like a response to this in the abstract is so hard. I feel like it depends so much on the context and the people, but I think the bigger issue is about this idea of Islamic authenticity as a singular thing. Like there's one thing that is Islam that we have to point to. And I think even within that world where people point to one thing, there's so many divergences within that world. So I'd say, as a pragmatic response, it's for all of us to learn about the fact that this is a over 1,400-year-old spiritual, intellectual, cultural tradition that spans the globe, and to think that there's something that is Islamic other than probably the very basic articles of faith, I would probably have a deep challenge and uncomfortability with. Because what counts as Islamic practice or Islamically legible or acceptable in one community is radically different in another. And I think this idea of kind of Arabic and Arabic being the center of Islam, I think oftentimes in even going back to where my family comes from, to South Asia, there's a deep and broad intellectual history within Urdu, within non-Arabic languages, where people are masters of Urdu who don't necessarily speak Arabic, but are, deeply grounded, thoughtful, globally respected Islamic scholars. So this idea that Arabic has to be the language of Islam, I think, is challenged in day-to-day practice and in history and in life. So I think part of it is just becoming more aware of the fact that Islam doesn't only exist within Arabic, but it exists in lots and lots of languages around the world.
That's a great point. Nafisa, any experience with this?
Yeah, I touched on it a little earlier, but I did grow up in an environment where most of my religious authority was my father, and he did come from this point of view that he was trying to transcend this lesser form of Islam by returning to the roots. And to be fair, when you look at a lot of Chinese Muslims, the way they practice the culture is very different, and a lot of things that you would consider haram, a lot of them drink alcohol, a lot of them still eat pork and stuff like that. Me and Sylvie were talking about it earlier. It's just so ingrained into the culture that it just kind of the religion gets swallowed up and then turned Chinese, which the Chinese are amazing at. Let's be honest. Look at Buddhism, right? Chinese as a culture generally just swallows things up and then makes it Chinese, and then they break a bunch of rules, and then it suddenly it becomes this cultural thing, and it's a cultural nuance, and that's it, It's so interesting to study, but so what. I had for the longest time had this bias that Arab culture was Islamic culture, was the Muslim culture, and I think one of the things that I've started to realize is you can't take the Arab Arab culture out of the equation, because that is where it started, But we also have to look to the future, and Arshad said this earlier, is this shared future. And learning that Islam can be multicultural and can be assimilated, and because ultimately what's important is the ideals rather than the practices, and it's just we're in this such an uncanny place, because a lot of people are more they feel that the practices are the proof of the ideals, and it's not always the same for everyone, and some people might find the ideals through the practice, or they might let go of the practices because of an ideal, and it just becomes really nuanced, and it really depends on the person and the place and everything. But yeah, there is this overarching at least from what I've grown up with, this Arab authenticity, even to the point where I have two older brothers, and the oldest one, he's the least religious, and me and the other one will start talking about the authenticity of the stuff, and he even brought up the 5 pillars of Sunni Islam, and we told him oh, that's actually hadith and not in the Quran, and he had this revelation of really, and this is yeah, that it was kind of a tradition that was created after, and it's just with all traditions and cultures, I think that they're not harmful inherently, but if people start to put more weight on it than more weight on it to the point where they start policing other people and oppressing other people, that becomes a really big problem. And I think that's something that a lot of us are facing right now in the as Muslims and stuff.
Yes. You guys all bring up some interesting points, and Islam in itself has transcended so much. From the beginning of time, has transcended so many different cultures and people, and as long as the essences are, this is my opinion, as long as the essence is there, that there shouldn't be a problem, and there should be no less Islamic version of.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring. Just speaking as a Chinese American Muslim, one of the things that people bring up all the time is the tradition of female imams in China. And so that's a perfect example of, there have been, I was reading an essay about how that came to be, because it was the result of conquest and war, that women loved, or they wanted to be Muslim, so deeply that they had to, out of necessity, create these new types of paradigms and traditions in which they could practice their faith. And that's actually the beauty of Islam, that there's this flexibility for it to kind of evolve and adapt to the types of circumstances that it needs to survive. Right? And so the same type of thing is happening in the U.S. You see that with the diversity in the cultures here, and right now it's in this place of kind of stretching and struggle. But I think it's actually very exciting to watch it unfold. Like Arshad said, here's that shared future is there, and people want it. People want it. So
Definitely. Okay, so we're going to move to Islamophobia and racism or discrimination. How does Islamophobia relate to anti-Asian discrimination in the U.S., past and present? What are some important lessons to take home? Do you have any insight, Dr. Ali?
Sure. Although I think Sylvia probably would be better starting off on this question.
Okay. Dr. Chan-Malik?
Well, I mean, I'll just give a brief overview. I mean, there's been a lot of wonderful work starting to be done in recent years, kind of thinking about the types of legal discourses that have been used by the state in the post 9/11 context to surveil and target and profile Muslim communities. So many people have, so there is this kind of evolution. Chinese Americans were the first group to be excluded from citizenship, or the first and only group to be excluded from citizenship in 1882 for the Chinese Exclusion Act. There were quotas on Asian immigration to the United States up until 1965, which is why there were quite small numbers of certain Asian groups in this country until then. And in 1965, the Hart-Celler Immigration Act passed, and so you see kind of a large number of people coming. The only group to be targeted and interned, like physically interned in this country, is Japanese Americans, which happened after the December 7th, 1941 bombing of Pearl Harbor. And Japanese Americans on the East Coast were rounded up and interned. So you have people making these comparisons to the situation of Muslims and Arabs, and those profiled as Muslim or Arab, South Asians, Sikhs, etc., in the post 9/11 moment. That there are these logics of internment, of exclusion, of xenophobia, kind of fear of immigrants, that feeds into. These are the types of logics that kind of America uses to define itself as a nation, and they're historically, traceable. The genealogy of them is traceable into the present, and you see all of those logics in the ways in which people kind of other Muslims and marginalize them and see them as always foreign, outsiders, etc. Yeah.
Dr. Ali, did you have anything to add?
Sure. I mean, I think Sylvia provided a lot of important guidance in this response. I mean, I think, just kind of building off what she said, whether it's kind of anti-Asian discrimination, anti-Muslim racism discrimination, anti-Black, these all kind of grow out of the same narrative of otherness within the context of the United States, this idea of defining particular bodies as not fully human being, right? Because that's, to me, that's what the core of it is. It's saying that some people count as full human beings and other people don't count as full human beings. And I think the ideas of kind of anti-Muslim racism, they have a long history that predate 9/11, they predate the Iranian Revolution, they predate America, and they predate this country. For myself, and I think for lots of us, we see it as kind of oftentimes, begin at least kind of within kind of the state structure, beginning with the Spanish Inquisition. So this idea of the Muslim as being the other from which kind of the West, whether it was Europe and now the U.S., defined itself, has been central. The construct of the Oriental other from Asia, from East Asia, or kind of from Asia as a whole, has been a trope that's existed long before the U.S. existed. So I think to really root these out, we have to think about a longer history. It's not going to come through a specific policy or a specific kind of action, but it's a long-term political, cultural, as well as legal shift. And I think kind of the last the second point I wanted to make is this idea of kind of anti-Asianism. It goes back to Sylvia's point much earlier in the conversation. The salience of an Asian identity only exists within the context of being outside of Asia. So kind of anti-Asian discrimination exists within the U.S. because particular bodies were then defined as Asian. And particular bodies now are being defined as Muslim within the U.S., whether they identify as Muslim or not. With the types of violence we've seen, particularly in the past decade plus, where individuals from Sikh backgrounds are attacked because they're thought to be Muslim. And the vast diversity of even people who identify as Muslim being lumped together as a singular entity. And this all, I think, for me, kind of comes back to this idea that, in this moment, these bodies are not thought of as fully human because they can't be individuals. They can't be something unique. And whiteness can be unique. Individuals who are white can be unique, but the Muslim, the other, can't be.
Great answer. Nafisa, we have a couple of minutes. Did you have anything to add?
I'll try to be quick, but I think in the context of the U.S., because it is a melting pot, I find a lot of Islamophobia is very racialized. Because, like, me being a Chinese Muslim and I don't wear hijab, I do not get the amount of, like, Islamophobia that, like, my cousins who are hijabis or my Desi friends or my Arab friends, they get so much more Islamophobia than I do. Like, I only get offensive questions when people find out, So, like, in America, like, it's not really, I find that it's, the religious, oppression is like a small part of it. A greater part is the more visible part, which is why Sikh temples get attacked constantly. And I think it's really interesting because, like, I have friends online who are like in Europe and stuff, and like they know they have a very different idea of Islam and like the racialization of it. And in America, it just becomes this so like kind of like this kind of like brown context, like brown bodies and such. And like, so for me, being someone who is like quote unquote yellow, I still kind of fit into like that meek like racialization. So I'm not a threat. Whereas people who are of Desi or Arab descent, they are seen as a threat, And like, I just think that when it comes to like being East Asian and Muslim, I need to like, it's so important to keep that in mind. That like there is this like racialization of it that is more violent than the things that I will like ever run into in my lifetime, and that is just important for like other Muslims who are not of those traditions and those cultures to listen to those voices, because they're the ones being attacked. So yeah.
That's an interesting point. Brown being more equivalent to being Muslim, and if you're more visually Muslim, then you are more under attack, or face more Islamophobic, or face more Islamophobia. We are done. So it's been an amazing conversation, everybody. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, I'd like to thank you personally, Dr. Nafisa. Nafisa, Dr. Chan-Malik, Dr. Arshad Ali. Thank you all so much. I hope we can have you with us again soon. For all our viewers at home, thank you for chiming in today with your questions and comments. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Tumblr. It's all there in the description. My name is Sabina Khan-Ibarra, and this has been a live panel discussion from MuslimARC. Hope to see you next time. Until then, Assalamu alaikum, and peace be with you.